Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our webinar this morning. This is a joint webinar between World Green Building Council's Europe Network and Alliance HQE, which is our French member, the French Green Building Council. Our topic today is a project that the French GBC, Alliance HQE, has been leading for a number of months now, pioneering a method to apply LCA and life cycle thinking to renovations. So we're going to be hearing this morning about that project and about some of the results, and hearing from some other fantastic speakers about the wider context and why it's so important to address life cycle issues when we think about renovation and scaling the renovation wave. We've got a great lineup of speakers for you this morning, so I'm excited to introduce them to you in a moment. For me, this is a topic that's very close to home. My home is going through a renovation at the moment, so that's why I'm sitting here in a warmer. It's cold, the heating's off as they fit new radiators. So this is a really fantastic topic. It's so important for the transition in Europe. We know how important renovation is, how critical it is to our climate and sustainability goals to achieve the renovation wave, and particularly as we think about the terrible situation that Europe is facing, and particularly the people of Ukraine are facing, and the implications of that for the energy transition, our energy independence. Renovation is becoming more and more a hot topic and a critical part of the future of Europe. So really excited about this topic today and this webinar, and want to welcome you very warmly. And I'll just briefly introduce our speakers to you. So we're very pleased to welcome Marjolaine. Marjolaine is the president of Alliance HQE, but she's also a member of the National Assembly in France, and has been a champion of the built environment and of renovation for many years. So it's a great pleasure to have her introducing our session this morning. Then we'll be handing over to my colleague Audrey. Audrey is our Global Director of Advocacy at the World Green Building Council, and she'll be talking a bit about the wider policy context. And then we come to the heart of the topic. We have a presentation from Simon. Simon is the Director of AIA Environment, and they have been the technical partner on this net zero carbon renovations project with Alliance HQE. Simon is going to talk us through the project and the results, and really take us into the detail of what this really groundbreaking initiative has achieved. Then we will hear from Anna Cunha, who is Director for the real estate sector at the consultancy Dians. She's also a very active supporter of the GBC movement generally, and particularly with Alliance HQE in France. It's great to have you with us this morning, Anna, and she's going to give us again a bit of the industry perspective on the renovation challenge, and reflect on some of the conclusions and outcomes of the project. And then finally, very pleased to welcome Guido den Teuling, who is Sustainability Manager for Radefco, and this project has been supported by the Radefco Foundation, which is the philanthropic arm of the Radefco business, the Radefco Group. Guido is working in the business, and will again give us the perspective from the industry, from the perspective of a big asset owner, on what it means what these results of this project mean for their business, and the particular challenges and opportunities around renovation for a large asset owner like Radefco. So there are speakers. We will have all of their presentations first, and then we'll have time for some Q&A with you, the audience. So if you're not familiar with Zoom webinar, if you've not done this before, you can, in your control panel at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A box, and you can put your questions in the Q&A box at any point during the webinar, and we will collect those. And during the Q&A session at the end, I will go through and put your questions to our panelists. And we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. I can't promise we'll get through them all, but we'll do our best. So that's how that works. And it just remains for me to say, enjoy the presentations, and we look forward to your questions coming through at the end. So I'm going to hand over without any further ado to our first speaker, Marjolaine. Marjolaine, the floor is yours.
Can you see me and hear me? Is it all right?
We can now, yes. Wonderful, thank you. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, dear friends, distinguished guests and fellow enthusiasts of a better, more sustainable living environment, well, good morning. I'm happy to be here with you today, and thank you for allowing me to say a few words on this very important topic, which current events, as you said, make even more critical than they were before. First of all, I would like to thank the team of the Net Zero Carbon Renovation Research Program, AIA Environment, of course, and in particular Simon Davis and Deans, especially Anna Kuna, who allow us today to share with the World GBC the results of the NZC Renovation Research Project, which was coordinated by the HQE GBC Alliance, which I represent. Also, of course, our partner, Radefco, who supported the project financially. Thank you for the support. And thanks as well to the World GBC, which is organizing this webinar today. Thank you very much for giving this important work an international reach. I have already had the opportunity to deliver as a preview the main lines of this study on low carbon renovation during the COP26 in Glasgow. And also a webinar organized by the Alliance HQE GBC has also presented the results of the Net Zero Carbon Renovation project in French in January. Today, I am delighted to introduce this conference, and I will be brief, as I'm sure that you are all very eager to hear all about the details of the conclusions of this research program that has taken 2 years of work. But first, very briefly, let me go back a bit on the question of renovation. In 2015, alongside the Paris Agreements, the French Energy Transition Law for Green Growth stipulated that by 2050, all existing buildings, whether public or private, housing or offices, had to be renovated so as not to consume more than 80 kilowatts per square kilometer per year. The objective at the time was to tackle 500,000 homes per year. But we've fallen behind, of course, as I think was the case all over Europe. So now we're talking in France about 1 million global renovation a year. It's enormous. It's almost impossible. And until recently, truth be told, we had a double problem. We couldn't engage households in deep enough renovations, and the total number of homes renovated each year was still insufficient, no matter what we did. Well, I'm happy to say that engaging people to renovate has become possible in France and all over Europe. In France, especially, thanks to a major transformation of simplification of the subsidy scheme, thanks to massive financial support for this objective, also European support. Thanks also, let's say, to the movement of the yellow vests, which triggered an unprecedented awareness of the fact that the renovation of buildings is the key to a socially just transition. And also the COVID confinements, the lockdown, has convinced everyone, even beyond the specialists, that renovation of buildings serves health and economic purposes, as well as environmental ones. Thanks to all these factors combined, the road to the massification of renovation is finally paved. But the change of scale to evolve from thermal renovation to low carbon renovation must be accompanied by concrete methods such as those which will be presented to you today. Methods that give the right impetus and will encourage to take the right path, to ask the right questions so that the low carbon renovation is successful. The research program team will present you a return on carbon investment time indicator and provide you with a hierarchy of levers for low carbon renovation, but also show the co-benefits of low carbon renovation, particularly at the socioeconomic level and quality of life. And you will see that in a world where we are aiming for 1.5 degrees, using this kind of information is vital for decision making. And to do this, the massive acculturation of construction access to this type of modeling is essential. Finally, our sector is today faced with the growing need to find a workforce capable of transforming climate objectives into real renovation sites. Addressing young people who are better aware of ecological issues through a training offer in environmental renovation constitutes a major challenge in responding to the climate emergency. To conclude, I would like to say that this research project also highlights the evolution of the building sector in France, and while new buildings have moved from thermal regulations to environmental regulations, we can easily imagine that the renovation of buildings will soon follow the same path in France and thus include carbon questions. Thank you very much for your attention and have a lovely conference.
Thank you so much, Marjolaine, for that great scene setting, and really fascinating to hear all those different different factors that are driving the uptake or the increase in awareness of the need for renovation. You mentioned the pandemic, but also the yellow vests. Yeah, really interesting to hear how those different aspects come together to raise this issue up the political agenda. So as we think about the political agenda, I would like to hand over the floor to our next speaker. We've already introduced her, Audrey, our Head of Global Advocacy, Director for Global Advocacy. Audrey, over to you to set the scene a little bit more in terms of the policy context at the European level. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Marjolaine, for those opening words. So I'm very excited to hear from our range of panelists on the details of the projects that they've been working on. But before doing that, I just wanted to zoom out a little bit, if we just go to the next slide, and just talk and set some context in terms of our global challenge and the policy response to that. So just a little bit about the World Green Building Council. We're a global network of 70 green building councils all around the world, and we work across 3 impact areas: climate action, health and well-being, resources, and circularity. So what each of our green building councils do is they represent the whole construction sector value chain, and they bring together those stakeholders to advance green and sustainable buildings, and they're aligned against those 3 impact areas that you see. So if you just go to the next slide. So I don't think I need to remind people of the crisis that we face when it comes to climate change. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this slide, but we need to take urgent action now if we're going to limit global heating to within 1.5 degrees that was agreed under the Paris Agreement. And I think it's important to remember that it's not just a climate issue, it's also a social justice issue. There's 4 billion people who are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and we really need to connect and collaborate to rise to the challenge that we face. And that means not just mitigating against climate change, but also building resilience. So there's a huge issue. And if you just look at buildings have a huge impact, but if we go to the next slide, I think there's also a real opportunity in leveraging the potential in the built environment as a solution to climate change. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with these stats, but I always think it's worth just taking a step back and really sort of absorbing them. When it comes to carbon emissions, buildings are responsible for 40%. They're responsible for 50% of extracted materials. So that is the impact that these buildings have. And when we look then at the projection in terms of the growth of buildings, we know that by 2060, the world's building stock is going to double. So that means the time is really running out. On the one hand, we've got this challenge in terms of the impact of buildings. We know that the number of buildings is going to double by 2060. So we need to find solutions, and we need to be innovative, and we need to collaborate if we're going to reduce emissions to meet a 1.5 degrees scenario. So we just go to the next slide. And that's what we're trying to do at World GBC. We're really trying to raise the profile and elevate buildings as a climate solution. Last year, ahead of COP26, which took place in Glasgow, we came together and collaborated with a range of organizations working in this space and united behind a common goal for a net zero resilient built environment in cities for everyone, everywhere. we were able to work with this coalition to elevate the profile of buildings at COP, and we were successful in securing a cities, regions and built environment day. If we just go to the next slide. And why that was so important is because as part of the Paris Agreement, countries agreed to outline what are called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And what this coalition really focused on was ensuring that countries, you know, and we're still doing this, it's a work in progress, would come to COP with building decarbonisation targets, concrete policies, and implementation mechanism in their NDCs. And that's really important. If every country in the world really recognizes the potential of buildings in their NDCs, then we can see that number, that 40% going down. And we also were able to unite around a common goal that by 2030, the built environment will halve its emissions, and that by 2050, all new and existing building assets would be net zero across the whole life cycle. So that means looking at both the operational impact, but also the embodied impact. So that was really, you know, hugely successful in terms of raising and positioning built environment as a critical climate solution. There was 130 events on the built environment. There was 26 announcements. We had 44 commitment signatories signing up to our updates, the Advancing Net Zero commitment to tackle whole life carbon by 2030. So we really were able to elevate, but that progress, you know, it continues. At the global level, we really need to ensure that, you know, countries are coming to COP every year, recognizing the role of buildings, talking about how to mitigate and adapt. And then there's also, you know, if you go to the next slide, we also need to look at, you know, when we zoom into the regions and specifically in Europe, the challenges and the policy response in Europe. So the European Commission has a goal to be climate neutral by 2050. If you go to the next slide. And there's a number of policies that the European Commission has outlined in order to deliver on that climate neutrality. So first of all, there's a European climate law. So that turns that goal of climate neutrality into a legal obligation. The European Commission, I think it was 2 years ago now, published the EU Green Deal. That's an action plan to boost the efficient use of resources by moving to a clean, circular economy, and doing so in a way that restores biodiversity and cuts pollution. Then we have the Fit for 55 package, and this is a set of proposals and directives that will help the EU reach its goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 55%, I should say, by 2030. And then obviously, and what we're all here for today, the renovation wave, which aims to at least double or triple the renovation rate of buildings. That currently stands at 1%. So the renovation wave is a key policy to really accelerate the rate and depth of renovation across Europe, because if we don't address the challenge of existing buildings in Europe, we have no chance of addressing the climate challenge and reaching that goal of climate neutrality. So we just go to the next slide. So in 2021, there's a number of different policy priorities that we're focusing on now when it comes to buildings. In December last year, the European Commission updated the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And there's some encouraging signals there. So first of all, it introduces minimum energy performance standards. It also introduces a definition of zero emissions buildings. Crucially as well, it also calls for whole life carbon reporting, which starts in 2027 for large buildings. So what that means is that for the first time, we're moving beyond just looking at the operational energy performance of the buildings, but looking at the operational and embodied together across the whole life cycle of the building. And that's really a really important aspect. And then also looking at harmonization of energy performance certificates. So that's a really key piece of legislation that is now being, you know, discussed by members of European Parliament. They're looking at what the Commission has proposed. The European Council is looking at it as well. And we expect to see a final update towards the end of this year or early next year. And just in what we're calling for, we welcome obviously the introduction of these elements in terms of MEPs and whole life carbon reporting, but we are calling at World GBC for greater ambition in terms of the timelines that I've outlined there. Another piece of work I think that's really interesting that the Commission have just embarked on is their own roadmap for whole life carbon. So this was promised under the Renovation Wave. And this work is just kicking off, but it's an 18-month study that's been commissioned by the European Commission that's going to set out quantified targets and benchmarks and limit values for buildings. And the purpose of that is to enable stakeholders to understand performance and improvement potential in buildings. And it's also going to help underpin European policies and strategies, objectives and visions. And that's a really, really crucial piece of work that I think is very much needed and should be welcomed by the community of stakeholders, because we'll finally get a really good understanding of the impacts that our buildings have. If you just go to the next slide. So we spoke a little bit at the beginning about World GBC, and I just wanted to kind of flash on screen here our European regional network. So this is our network of green building councils in Europe and the partners who support us. And what we're doing as a network is we're working collectively to respond to the challenges we face in Europe, but also to find the solutions that we need. So if we just go to the next slide. We have, aligned around 3 different policy priorities, and that is what our network advocates for, develops projects to demonstrate, how we can implement and action our goals. So we're focused on building renovations. Obviously, that's a huge challenge in Europe, energy efficiency and whole life carbon. And if you go to the next slide, I've just put a quick snapshot of some of the projects, that help us deliver on those policy priorities. So we have two kind of flagship projects. We have our Build Upon project, and that's really focused on renovation of existing buildings. It was initially started in 2015. And basically our conclusion there was that national renovation strategies should focus on facilitating action at local and city level. And then that led to Build Upon Squared, which advanced on the findings of the first phase of the project to engage with European cities to design and facilitate local action to implement national renovation strategies. So what we developed there was a framework of indicators to measure the impact of buildings on not just climate change, but as Marjolaine said, there's other aspects in terms of renovation that are really important. So looking at aspects like health and well-being, energy poverty, all of those things, economic opportunities created by jobs. So really providing a tool so that cities can see the impacts that building renovation projects, but also revealing where these can be scaled. And then lastly, just looking at Building Life, which is a project we're running with 10 of our green building councils across Europe to support and accelerate the ambitions of the Green Deal by setting out roadmaps to deliver on whole life carbon policy, so operational and embodied. So that's just a little bit of an overview. If we just go to the next slide. Of the work that we're doing at World GBC in terms of advocacy when it comes to built environment. So I'll be happy to take any questions during the Q&A if anyone has anything they would like to ask. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Audrey. Great to get that big picture context of what's going on. And great to hear about some of those projects that green building councils across the region are working on. Which is a very neat way to introduce our next speaker. So we've heard a little bit about some of the projects happening across Europe from the Green Building Councils. We're now going to do a deep dive into the detail of this really exciting project that Alliance HQE have been leading in France on the Net Zero Carbon Renovation Programme. Just while we do the transition to Simon's slide deck, just a quick reminder to the audience that you can put your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll be collecting those as we go through, ready to put them to our panel of speakers at the end. I can see there's a couple of questions coming in already, so please do drop your questions in as we go, and we'll do our best to get through as many of them as we can at the end. So I see Simon's slides appearing. That's well timed. So Simon, I will hand over the floor to you. Please take us through the exciting results of this great project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I'm really thrilled with joining you and presenting you all the findings and perspectives from the Net Zero Carbon Renovation research program. So maybe a quick overview of what is the NZC renovation program. We had three big tasks to do. First was a practice review and methodology concerning detailed methodology guidance for evaluation of whole cycle carbon for existing buildings. Then we had to face the diversity of renovation. And our methodology was to identify business cases, storyboards of 7 representative business case that we identified by consulting a building professional. I will show you those 7 business cases in just a minute. And then an optimization phase. And the target was to achieve net zero carbon in refurbishments and to identify relevant solutions to meet net zero carbon. And that's what I will present to you today. And of course, consultation, communication during all the projects. So just to remind you a bit, there are 7 business case that represent the diversity of renovation in the French market. And so this is one of the key challenge that we have to tackle in the renovation low carbon process. And of course, each scenario, each business case is different, and you have to adapt the strategy. But these 7 families appears really relevant if you want to capitalize about the strategy that you have to apply. So I would just try to show you quickly a video that we just made about the project to maybe try to explain you a bit what it's all about and what are the key findings of the project. So basically the big question was, is a renovation always low carbon? And that was the concept that defined the carbon neutrality for a renovation project. And to do it, we compare a non-renovated building with a renovated building. And we add the initial carbon footprint, then the renovation carbon footprint, the embedded footprint. And then there are operational carbon emissions, and then a balance is reached. This balance is the CRT, the carbon return time, which is sometimes 10 years, sometimes 20 years. And of course, the lower it is, the better it is to the planet. So basically, the question is not, is a renovation low carbon, net zero carbon or not, but when will it be in time? And of course, we studied those 7 cases, and the answer was different each time. So basically, the NZC renovation program then identified 5 levers to lower these return time carbon. First one is tacticity, deals with the diagnosis and the better effort gain ratio during program. Then there is circularity, which deals with reuse, on-site reuse, on-site recycling, and off-site reuse using an online platform, for instance. Then there is materiality, all the embedded carbon of new materials. And of course, you can reduce it in a significant way by using eco-material and dealing it with the inheritors of the building. And then there is a really important strategy, which is technicity. It deals with the low-tech approach and simple and proven technical system that you can use. And last lever is externality. We consider the surrounding of the building and the close environment. And of course, you can have co-benefit for the environment, but also for the collective health, if you consider, for instance, mobility. And of course, you can have a positive externality for the local economy. So basically, encouraging new low carbon lifestyle at the scale of the neighborhood is also a kind of positive externality. So basically, this is a sum up of the different findings of the program. And now I can maybe explain to you a bit about the data. We can dig in the data a bit if I just can just show you some data and some results now about the program. And so this is a representation of the different footprints of the 7 business cases. And as you can see in this diagram, each dot represents one contributor impact. And when we have this visualization, this representation, we can see that each building is really different. There is a great diversity of carbon footprints. And so we call it carbo diversity. This is one of key findings. Each case is really different from one another, and we have to adapt all those levers in each case. Second finding, if we consider figures, is the fact that the embodied carbon part of the impact is pretty significant. First, we thought that as we are in a renovation context, we use less material, so the impact on the whole cycle would be lower. It is true, but it represents from 25% to 80% of the global LCA footprints, depending on how deep is the renovation and, of course, the function of the building. If you are in an activity building, an office, for instance, the footprint will be higher. And then we studied 2 versions of the different business cases, and we calibrated it to see what was the building in agreement with the regulation versus a building that is really optimized with best practice. And using it, we can see that there is a great level of optimization for each of the scenario, each of the business case. This optimization goes from 40% to 60%. So we must accelerate a lot national regulation in France, for instance, to integrate the carbon impact. Because using only the energy regulation to renovate, as you can see, there is a great gap to be filled with optimization. And so I just told you a bit about the carbon time return time. There is another way of explaining it, considering cumulated CO2 emissions. Basically, if you have a scenario without renovation and a scenario with renovation, the 2 curves there will cross at a point, and this point is the gross carbon return time. And before this time, of course, the carbon investment of renovation is not yet compensated. And after this time, the carbon investment of renovation is compensated. So if we have a go on the results now about the different 7 families of projects, you can see that this gross carbon return time is pretty different from one scenario to another. Basically, it varies from around 75 years if you don't consider it, if you don't take into account optimization, to less than 10 years. And so we think it's a really good indicator to take into consideration, because it means that in certain cases, the renovation, we will have to wait 75 years until the renovation is really useful to the planet, is really useful to lower emissions. So this is quite interesting that this time approach changes maybe everything. And I talked a bit about the different levers that I explained to you. And what is interesting is that for each lever, we were able to identify magnitudes for different solutions. And I think that all those figures will help the designer in order to integrate those strategy early in the project process. So basically, you will have in these reports all those figures, and that will be really useful to optimize your project in the first place. Even if the LCA calculation is needed when you reach a certain detail in the project, you can have a first assumption that will be good with those figures. And it is, we detail also in the report the process of NZC renovation during the project, from programming to operational life. And as you can see, there are different steps, and the different level, they are not in the same time in the project in terms of intensity, in terms of study. So basically, that's the new timeline for the renovation project, where you can integrate this NZC approach. And as Marjolaine told you before, we also identified the different co-benefits of those 5 levers for net zero carbon renovation. And so, of course, there are environment, collective health, and economy. And as you can see in this really complicated diagram, is that there is a great interdependence between factors. And so you have to consider not only energy, not only carbon footprint, but all those indicators, all those factors as a whole. So this is the global renovation. That must be the key to have co-benefits, and of course, reducing impact in the environment. And so we will release in a few days in English version, because for the moment it's only French, 2 reports where you can find all the things I told you. First, a technical report. It's a life cycle analysis study, and the NZC optimization of business cases. And another report, which is maybe more graphic, more available for a non-technical reader. It's a booklet of low carbon levers in renovation, detailing all the different levers I told you: tacticity, circularity, materiality, technicity, and externality. Okay, I hope I wasn't too long, but it was great sharing with you all those results. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Simon. Thank you so much. I see some questions already coming in. Lots of interest in the technical details. So we'll be grilling you shortly on the detail of the project in a bit more in a bit more depth. But before we come to that, it's a pleasure to welcome Anna Cunha from Derns. Anna is our next speaker, and is going to give us a bit more sort of the industry perspective and reflect on perhaps some of the implications of this work for industry actors. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet, not yet.
Let me just, I'm trying to. Oh, here it goes. I think that now you should be seeing it.
Yes, we see it. Thank you, Anna.
Yes.
Over to you.
Good. So thank you, and thank you also, Simon, for the introduction before, because actually my presentation will actually go through the challenges and fields that can be explored, also that were mentioned by Simon, giving examples also outside of France, since his outcomes, actually the outcomes of the study, are applicable also beyond France, where the study was done. So indeed, when we want to do low carbon renovation, we need to look at different fields, at different elements, and I'll try to give a flavor with some case studies also from projects, from renovation projects performed by Derns. So Derns does the mechanical, electrical, plumbing design, sustainability design, and smart building design. So the goal is to show how actually these concepts that were mentioned before and outcomes of the study can really apply to all types of projects, and need to be integrated in a holistic approach to go beyond just LCA, but indeed look at the different fields and players that look and deal with the building. One of the elements that Simon had mentioned was the tacticity. Indeed, it's important that we rethink the uses to avoid building more. Audrey's slide was saying that we are heading to actually have to double the number of buildings. So when we see the challenge of reducing carbon emissions, we really need to see how to intensify actually the use of these buildings and find a good balance between preserving the existing built environment and the long-term gains. And to illustrate how actually this challenge of the low carbon renovation deals with different specialties and considerations, I mentioned the case of Adam Tower, which was the winner of the Golden Phoenix Award for the transformation category. The Adam Tower that you see here in the screen was the old offices of Shell in Amsterdam, and actually he went through a renovation. We must know that prior to the renovation, the building had 4 lifts, conventional controls, and those 4 lifts were enough for an occupation of the 500 staff members that occupy the offices of the tower. It was a single-use type of tower, and after the renovation, actually the aim was to make the tower multi-use, multi-function, and to actually be used on a daily basis by 3,000 to 5,000 people per day, which means multiplying by 6 to 10 times actually the previous use of the tower. It's not just enough to look at the life cycle assessment. When we want to be able to densify the occupation of a building, we need to look at installations. We must know that to move from one occupation of 500 people to 3,000 to 5,000, actually it would require at least 7 to 8 lifts in a building instead of 4. You cannot easily change the core of a building. It's new materials, it's structural, it's more embodied carbon. And actually in this case, there was no space to add 4 or 5 lifts, nor budget for it. So this illustrates how actually when we are aiming to an intensification of use, optimization of the uses of the built environment, we need necessarily to look to other angles. This image shows you how the building was. It was occupied by offices, 18 floors, and it became actually a building occupied by offices, residential, lofts, hotel, event, fitness, restaurants, and all that. So a multiplication of uses, bringing people to the building at different times of the day. And for this, we need to look at the design of the buildings, design of renovations from different angles, efficiency and organization and multi-criteria. We need to think of limiting the peaks of occupation and optimizing the logistics and processes for the benefit of design and use. And a strong collaboration between engineering and architecture, because I think that the success of low carbon renovation relies really on these holistic and integrated design approaches. And intensification of use is not improvised. It needs to be addressed conveniently in early stages so that we can really make the best out of a building and optimize such renovation. And in this case, it required early stage considerations of logistics, vertical transportation that actually allowed to make this transformation and only add 1 building, limiting therefore the integration of new materials and equipments that when we see Simon's presentation, these equipments, when it's about renovation, do weigh a lot in terms of embodied global impact. So this is just to give a picture of what the tower became a hub of uses, of interaction, renovated a part of the city and brought people in, and was intensified to finally become a building that multiplied by 10 its occupation on a daily basis. But this needs integration. It needs to optimize the whole materials, the whole equipments and solutions, and make early stages to understand the potential of such use intensity. It doesn't arrive at the end of the process. One element that Simon mentioned was indeed the technicity. We need to find a way to, when we're planning a renovation, for it to be low carbon, to choose smartly the technical systems. They have an impact embodied, although they optimize the operations part, they have an embodied impact that is not neglectable. So we need to choose smartly the technical systems and shall carefully avoid add-ons without a specific purpose. We need to see how less is more, how less materials, less equipments do more in terms of functionality. And that's why I give the example of one of the buildings of design, so the Microsoft headquarter, Outlook. It shows actually how digital can help supporting sustainability and use intensity. Because in this building, which was an old building, the client decided to renew. And I think that the interesting part of this is to bear in mind that we need to challenge and change the way we design buildings. We need to bring innovation, but we need to approach data and information that we have available for us to optimize the design of the buildings. In this case, the building prior to renovation was occupied by Microsoft, 11,500 square meters were occupied by the tenant, Microsoft, for 700 employees. When we approach this, actually we started the other way around. Usually we look technology to the user experience that you'll get at the end. In this case, a smart infrastructure was put into the building temporarily to sense what happens inside, to understand what was the real use, where people were. Do they occupy meeting places by 3 or by 10 people? What are the zones that they prefer to work on, and conditions, temperature, and all that. And actually, after this data gathering, this initial stage, this information was used to confirm the real needs in terms of space, in terms of occupation, in terms of comfort. And this information was used in the renovation design. So this shows how actually we can have a data-driven also design to have optimized scenarios and an optimized renovation. And indeed, this renovation allowed to transform this office in a service, office as a service, the concept, and even adapt the business model between the tenant and the landlord. Because in this case, after renovation, actually, Microsoft used less space, they leased less space, only 8,500, so 30% less, but they put almost 50% more people inside, which shows that actually this renovation was about improving the energy efficiency of the building, whose consumption decreased by 85%, but also intensifying the use, less space, but more flexibility, more functionality, so that we can make more in less space. And actually the savings generated in occupying, leasing less space and saving resources and energy cover the capex needed to do this renovation, knowing that the remaining space, the 3,000 remaining space, were occupied by another tenant. So everybody was happy in the process, and it shows how we can think smartly, the good combination of digital and sustainability to succeed improvement of performance and use intensity and functionality and better healthy spaces for users. Because in this case, not only we had to renew in terms of resources the building, as we had to define with the tenant and the landlord, the pathway, the experience, what we wanted to see happening in the building, and how the technical infrastructure should reply to that, being able to evolve without having to be changed regularly, which would represent even a bigger carbon impact in time. And we must not forget that indeed digital smart devices do have an embodied impact, and we need to select them smartly so that this carbon return time that Simon had mentioned in his presentation doesn't get more and more increased, instead of simply reducing the time to have a carbon return happening fast. And this is just an example of actually how transforming it to be sustainable and using data-driven models also, it was possible to monitor real time what happens in the building, its use, optimize resources consumption, and also even automatize the extraction of information for ESG purposes. It served the tenant, but it served also the landlord, that by doing this in one building, he was able to connect the different buildings also that they had nearby, to be able to propose space as the demand evolves, and connect finally synergies between buildings and allowing tenants to evolve in terms of occupation and creating added value for everybody with a strong logic of renovation. So it's important to reduce the carbon impact. It's important to focus on service to be able to use more and better, and to see technology as a tool, not just as a goal as in itself, a tool to intensify the use. Shall we have less space? Okay, but let's be able to provide more services, more flexibility without having to change often. The next step, also mentioned, was circularity and materiality. It's important to have the right material at the right place. How can we incorporate in the projects an ambitious circular economy strategy every time we touch a project, and how actually the waste of some can be the resources of others? And for this, I give the example of one of our projects, BioPartner 5. It is an office and life science laboratory. It's the first energy neutral lab in the Netherlands. So it shows actually how the operations part of this building was strongly worked to minimize the energy demand, to be able to produce it on site, but also how the circular strategy came since the beginning of the project, to reusing and selecting the best materials. Actually, 165 tons of steel were used in this building, used from a building that was being demolished just nearby to build a new structure that was actually transformed nearby, also of the construction site. Form of slate steps was also used as toilet tiles in the building. Glass office walls that were put in here that you see in the images served once in a governmental building nearby too. Rubble-filled gabions that form a low-tech green facade that you see in the picture were also produced for this building, and old KPMG entity toilets have been given a new life also in the project. So actually this shows how it's important to see the waste of other buildings as resources for our own, to also work on this embodied carbon reduction. And for this specific project, the circular strategy allowed to reduce 40% of the embodied carbon linked to construction materials, including the considerations used in the choice of lower impact solar panels that produce the energy here. So it allowed to save more than 200 tons of CO2 with this project, and it highlights how actually having platforms with information about materials so that we can go get it and introduce in our own chain, find easily materials that allow us to design with reused elements, but also have information, have building passports that list exactly what is in the building, so that we can start planning the end of life and reintroduction of the chain to make these renovations and new buildings even lower in carbon impact. And finally, I would mention the externalities that Simon mentioned. We need to think beyond the perimeter of one building alone. We need to think of synergies between buildings and make use, always think of making use of resources available on site. It's about functional innovation. Here I give some examples of the buildings you may know, others less. When we designed Bosco Verticale, it was designed to be an icon of biodiversity and sustainability, but actually the energy strategy uses an aquifer with water integrated in an energy center that is not building by building, but was done for the neighborhood to feed in heat and cooling. And that water of the system is actually used for the irrigation of the building. So this shows how actually we can think low carbon biodiversity and think of mutual energy centers instead of building per building, because it also allows to reduce the number of equipments and make them mutual to different buildings. Edge Olympics is an example of renovation too. It's the little brother of the Edge, the headquarters of Deloitte, which we also designed. So this renovation integrated an ATES, aquifer thermal energy storage, and that has a data-driven operation. So that indeed the renovation that in terms of circular strategy also uses elements from the previous facade that are now as finished flooring. How we need to think of multi-criteria, because the LCA alone won't do the whole transformation alone. New Time is an example of use of these resources nearby too. It's a renovation of an office building that actually decided to use the river water in Paris for cooling and heating, strongly reducing by more than 50% the energy demand of the building just with that solution. And B30 is a very old building that was converted into very functional and high efficiency label A renovation building using geothermal and with a local energy production and storage, innovative materials that make the buildings also very low emissive during operations, but that reuse the maximum as they could in their design, materials coming from different locations. So as main insights, I would say that it's important to reduce impacts through a multi-criteria approach. LCA is only part of the picture. We need to make an integrated view how to transform it. It requires all type of expertise and thinking this very early. Think of use, not just square meters. We think we need to better use the existing square meters, re-question the use we want and optimize it. Always think and to find a good balance between high tech and low tech so that you do an optimization and think of carbon return time and remain sober, not superfluous, and really make the buildings to operate better and to be more resilient and flexible to evolve as also uses and users evolve. Functional innovation. This synergy between buildings are very important. We need to explore because they can be a very good vector of low carbon reduction when approaching the sustainability strategy of renovations for buildings alone or in the field of a neighborhood or city development. And this makes us think that indeed we need to move from impact per square meter, kilogram of impact per square meter, but to also integrate other elements like per user or per hour if we are aiming to intensify the occupation and use of these buildings so that the use is also improved in terms of reduction of carbon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anna, for that really insightful presentation, and great to hear that final message around just thinking about the use of resources and that the French word sobriety is a great way to encapsulate that. So great to see that Dens has been doing that so effectively in some of those projects. Thank you. We will move straight on to our final speaker. So I'm very pleased to welcome Guido Ntoiling from the Radefco Foundation, who is, the floor is yours, Guido, to give us your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. So good morning, everyone. My name is Guido Ntoiling, Sustainability Manager at Radefco. Been there for about 5 years. I will be talking a little bit about a little case study about one of the buildings that we brought to all electric in that sense, the first step to net zero carbon, but also go a bit more through the challenges that we faced going through that whole process. So next slide, please. So as we said, going all electric, we see it as a first step towards net zero carbon buildings because we are cutting out a whole lot of emissions that are usually associated with burning fossil fuels for heating or hot water. So next slide, please. So first, a little bit of key highlights of who we are at Radefco. Radefco is a European investment management firm, and we have a passion for inner city urban environments. We have a combined portfolio of about 7 billion, 285 assets under management throughout Europe, which equals about 2.4 million square meters. And in 2021, 94% of our investment volume was BREEAM certified. We also launched something what we called Mission 2040. And our ambition is to be a force for better, and we want to do that by deliberately future-proofing our assets whilst they're under our stewardship, and also to demonstrate environmental, social, and government leadership through projects and actions that inspire us, but also our sector. And our North Star, actually our big ambition to do is to make all our assets under management net zero carbon by 2040. And with all our assets under management, we don't mean only our operational emissions, but we're really looking at all our assets and our tenanted spaces as well. So next, please. So first, what we started looking at is renovating towards net zero carbon. One of the things that really briefly want to talk about is a building in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. It was a redevelopment of a fairly large building, 9,000 square meters, 1950s, just built after the war, so it had some heritage aspects as well. It was a 4-story single tenant building. And we converted it to a multi-tenant, highly energy efficient building. So in order to do that, obviously we had to tackle several things. So first of all, we look at the building shell, where we modernized and upgraded the facade, the protected facade. We also installed what they call insulated glazing and window frames. And by doing that, we actually formed a highly insulated shell. So we're making sure that whatever energy we're going to use for heating the building is actually as low as possible. We also started talking to our tenants, specifically around LED lighting. in retail settings, lighting is often the most energy consuming part of their operations. So changing to energy efficient and low energy consuming lighting is very, very important. We installed energy efficient escalators and lifts to make sure that whatever vertical transportation there is as energy efficient as possible. And we also installed about 126 photovoltaic panels on the roof, which is approximately 40 kilowatt peak. One of the big things we did is actually disconnecting it from the natural gas grid for heating purposes. In the Netherlands, I think buildings are predominantly heated by natural gas and through our boiler systems to provide hot water. But we really wanted to make a statement and say, in this building, we want to disconnect it and be ahead of the curve in that sense. We also install submetering because we want to capture operational energy consumption, because that is really what we use as Radefco to understand how we perform, where we're doing well and where we need to improve. And finally, we want to target the BREEAM Excellent certification, which is what we're aiming for. And hopefully this year we will achieve that. So next. So a few challenges that we actually face when we work towards net zero carbon. I think one of the main challenges that we have, or maybe also one of the opportunities, is we have existing buildings. And with existing buildings, there are often limitations, what is technically possible, both with the building itself and also the location they're in. Usually we have retail setting. A retail setting is different from office setting, is that we as a landlord control the building envelope, whereas the tenant is in control of all the services. So there's a bit of a split incentive there to upgrade that. So we have no control over what kind of lighting, we have no control over what kind of installations are there, but we can try to work together to see if we can actually come to solutions that benefit both. We have a lot of inner city locations. Often that means limited roof space for solar photovoltaics, but also a lot of overshadowing of buildings and lots of services that are on the roof could also prevent us from putting solar PV on the roofs. Geothermal is not always possible. You can't always drill in the soil to find the right layers and to have enough space to actually take account of that. And there's also obviously a potential noise issue from equipment that you install on the site. One other thing that was for us something new and something that we are trying to tackle and work on is looking at outcomes-based target setting. So we use CRREM pathways as guidance. They're EU-wide targets, and I think they are at the moment the best and most up-to-date targets, showing us where we need to be within the 1.5 degree scenario in 2050. But it does require very knowledgeable and involved partners, because you have to look at design all the way through to operation, and also a different mindset. Coming from certifying with BREEAM, looking at what we want to do with the buildings, which is at times more of a tick box exercise, we really start looking now at how can we design and redevelop a building from the ground up to be net zero carbon. Different kind of KPIs, target setting, looking at energy use intensities or carbon intensities, rather than specifying specific amounts of insulation or types of glazing. Next, please. So a bit into disconnecting from the natural gas grid. Obviously, if you want to get to a net zero carbon building in operation, you really have to make sure that you have a highly energy efficient building. So that's what we tackled with going to a very highly energy efficient shell. But we also say that we don't want any combustion of fossil fuels to generate heat or hot water. As I said, traditionally, and this is specifically in the Netherlands, that is through natural gas. And in Eindhoven, we disconnected that. That meant also that we had to talk to the network operator or the grid operator for electricity, because we are going to have a much higher demand for electrical power in an all-electric building than if we would just have the natural gas connection still. So we really had to make sure that whatever we wanted to do was able to be delivered, which fortunately was the case, but also making sure that the network could actually handle it. The other thing that we looked at, we go into a multi-tenant building, so we need to really talk to our tenants and make them understand that they need to go to all electric operations. One of the challenges that we did have is that we went from a fashion retailer to also retailers that have food and beverages activities. And food and beverage, obviously, you're looking at kitchens, and kitchens you're quite often looking at natural gas connections. So here we also had to talk and make sure that our tenants were on board and could help us with that. So it brings us to the next slide, where we're looking at the importance of tenant engagement. So as I said before, when you look at retail settings, a landlord is in control of the building envelope and the tenant is in control of its services. So that creates that split incentive we talked about. So disconnecting the building from natural gas was a bit of a different thinking. We had a food and beverage activities that we had to take into account. So we had to really work closely with the tenant to make sure that they understood what was actually involved. So obviously tenant engagement is always going on, but we really wanted to start that very early on. So before you actually sign any lease agreements, and you also want to talk about it throughout the whole project, so to make sure that actually what's being installed and what's going on is actually working. We did challenge them as well, just to say you have to go to all electric solutions, as well as to improve the energy efficiency. And as a result, obviously we got the food and beverage using all electric kitchen facilities, which was for them in some cases quite new, full electric or full LED lighting by the tenants, which surprisingly is not always the case in retail settings, obviously more and more, but not always. And also we installed the all electric heat pumps, energy efficient lifts, and also the escalators in the building. So to make sure that we go into all electric. Next slide. Next thing we looked at was on-site energy generation. Obviously, roofs are often suitable for the installation of solar PV, which is actually what we do for another project we call Project Solar. We have a large portfolio of retail parks in Belgium, and we are actually going to install all the roofs of those buildings with solar panels to generate electricity for the tenants and the majority going back into the grid. However, Eindhoven is an urban environment, so the photovoltaic installations are more complicated, and they're also overshadowing and other constraints, specifically around heritage or what a building looks like and how it impacts that look. So we originally actually considered solar installations on the roof, but also on the rear facade. It was a south-facing facade and a pergola above the installations. However, we had to sort of discard them at the time that we actually wanted to create the building, because of the low efficiency of those panels, but also high costs and a substandard design. Since then, obviously things do evolve, and we don't discard it altogether for this building. So we really keep an eye on what is there, what is available, and see if we can actually integrate it into the design at a later stage, but also making sure that we keep looking at these kinds of solutions for future redevelopments, where we can integrate those building integrated photovoltaics. So next. So we looked at carbon in operation, net zero carbon in operation, but obviously we want to go towards whole life carbon, because the challenges of net zero carbon don't stop at operations only. I think throughout the previous presentations that was also very clearly outlined, and it is something that we really start looking at. So as you can see, this is a kind of a 7-step process that we also follow, which was developed by Kandel. And actually to start the journey, we actually start to include targets on embodied carbon in our new developments and redevelopments. So rather than only looking at operation carbon, we're now also looking at embodied carbon. And this is also that different mindset that I talked about a little bit earlier. We also start specifying low carbon materials. You can do that by actually saying we want bio-based materials and hybrid solutions, but also specifying low carbon materials comes from setting the right targets. If you start targeting maximum of kilograms or tons of emissions per square meter when you do redevelopments, obviously low carbon materials will come out as a preferred element. And we started to use design and construction methodologies in line with cradle to cradle and circularity principles. Cradle to cradle we've used in a retail park in Belgium, where we also looked at how we can take the building apart after its useful life. So using the design for disassembly kind of thoughts. And we also started using less concrete in that building, but looking at wood and looking at steel constructions that we can repurpose at the end of life. Next. So that brings me to the final slide. So we signed the World Council Net Zero Carbon Buildings Commitment. The requirements of that commitment are consistent with our science-based target for 2030 and also our Mission 2040 roadmap. but we also want to make sure that the commitments are signaling and building momentum amongst our peers to take action. I think taking action is one of the things that we really dearly need to do. We've been talking too long, and we are still talking a lot at the moment. But I think the time is now, and the time is now to really start doing and practice what you preach in that sense. So that's a little bit of an overview from Radefco's point of view.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Guido, for that presentation and for ending with that call to action. It's great to see that Radefco is practicing what's being preached here. That's a really inspiring message. So thank you to all our speakers. I have to apologize on behalf of Marjolaine, who gave the introduction. She's had to leave for another meeting. But the other panelists are ready to take some of your questions. So I've seen quite a few questions coming in the chat, lots of interest in the methodology. We'll start with a few of the more general questions about the project. So there's a couple of questions about when will things be available, will English translations be available, that kind of thing. So maybe, Simon, you touched on that briefly in your presentation, but maybe you can just again recap. Where can people find the information? When can they expect to see the reports translated into English? Are you able to just briefly give people that information again?
Yes, so basically we have two new reports I explained in my presentation, but at the moment we are translating those reports, and it's not quite finished yet, so it should be available in English version at the end of March, I think. And the end of March is almost done. And but you can find the report in French in the HQE website. It is already available in French, but we will keep you informed about it, and we'll give you the link when we have it.
Fantastic, thank you. Great. So do follow the Alliance HQE Twitter feeds, or you can follow the World GBC Twitter feed. We'll make sure that once those reports are available, we post that far and wide so that everybody knows where to find it. So we'll stick with project details. There's a few technical questions about the project. We'll start with a question about the methodology, and again, Simon, I think this is probably one for you to take. There's a question come in from Michael around how you address the embodied carbon of the residual materials in the building. Is that something that's assessed or addressed in the methodology? Do you account for those materials?
Yes, that's a good question, because in the methodology we use, we consider that if a material has not reached its basic duration, life duration, we consider that it has still a residual carbon emission that is, proportional to the age of the product, of the material, divided by its theoretical maximum duration. So we use it we use this method because in specific cases, especially a ground floor of building or commercial area, product maybe have just 4 or 5 years time used. And so we use this method in order to encourage reuse of those materials, counting their impacts in all the scenarios if they are disposed for instance.
Great, thank you, Simon. I just encourage all our panelists to turn your cameras back on, if that's okay. We'll as we move into this panel session. Looking at the questions, we have another question sort of around technical issues to do with the methodology. So again, for you, Simon, to begin with. So the question is around how how you address the end-of-life recyclability and end-of-life carbon savings in the circularity lever. There's a question from Bernal. So Simon, could you address that for us? Thank you.
Yes, it's a good question, a really technical one. Basically, when we don't reuse a material, we take into account the emissions linked to its end of life, its recyclability. And when we recycle the material and reuse it, like for gabion wall, for instance, then we didn't have a state-of-the-art methodology to do that. So we had to investigate on how much energy was consumed to do it. For instance, if you use materials from the building and you just make a concrete with it, for instance, you will have to consider all the impacts of this action, breaking the waste in small pieces and then making your concrete with it, for instance. And then, as they were not state-of-the-art methodology, we had to make assumptions, and based on our capitalization of experience in this specific case.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. And a final technical question before we move on to some of the bigger picture questions. There's a question around bio-based solutions from Andrew Norton. And his question is, should the carbon stored, the carbon storage of materials, so particularly relevant for bio-based materials, is that something that should be included in the assessment? Is it included? Is that something that you've taken account of in the Lca methods applied? Simon.
So basically, we used what is called a static Lca method. It means that the sequestration of carbon is taken into account, but not as much as other methods. Or if you take a dynamic method, you will lower the impact of the carbon at the end of life, and you will increase these bio-based sequestration potential of your building. So this is one of the issues that we have to face now. It's because in France, the environmental regulation has changed a bit the methods, and now it's a dynamic method. And so it will be interesting to adapt the study, the project, to this new method, because of course, bio-based material will increase their interest regarding the fact that they store carbon a bit. So that would be interesting to see how the results change considering this method.
Thank you, Simon. That's great. So we've dealt with some of the technical detail. Just like to take a little bit of a step backwards, sort of step out. So zooming out, we have one question about the levers presented, and again, this is probably for you, Simon. We'll come to questions for the other speakers in just a moment. One final one for you here. Is there a sense of an order of priority or importance in the levers that you've presented in your presentation today?
That's also a really good question, because when we chose this order, there is a meaning for it, because it represents the design process. Basically, first you have the program, the diagnosis. So tacticity is a good way to start the approach, of course, but it is also an order that reflects maybe how we can master those levers. And especially the two last levers are technicity and externality. Maybe they are the two levers with maybe the greatest potential now, but maybe they are the two levers where we face difficulties, where we face important difficulties with the data, for instance, for technical equipments, and for concrete solutions from the manufacturers also. And externality is also a methodology issue because it is basically outside of the box, outside of the perimeter of the project. So how can you count it, take it into account? There is no, in my opinion, current state-of-the-art methodology to do it. So basically the order also reflects how we are able to master the degree of uncertainty due to each level. And so it's interesting, but as Anna said, it does not reflect exactly the importance in terms of impact. Because, for instance, in renovation, technicity might be one of the greatest impact that we can have, that we can improve. So it should be maybe upfront in this perspective. Yes.
Thank you. Great. So
I think, Stephen, just
yeah, Anna, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Just to complete, I think that the strength of the study is exactly to show the elements that shall be considered. It's not just one single and one moment in time consideration. We really need to change the way we look the building design, the potential of the building, not just limit this for engineering and for architecture, but also on the client. They need to be open to do differently and to consider other scenarios, to take another risk, so that we can really make a revolution of the carbon result at the end. So I think that the strength of the study is really highlighting considerations that should systematically at least be mentioned or discussed in terms of potential in the design process.
That's really true. It's also programming issues, and clients also, and constructors also, and the tenant has a really important role, especially for externality, tacticity. So yes, it's not only technical and designers that are concerned by the study. That's interesting to point out.
But because this issue of the program is very important. If we keep doing things adding at the end as the project evolves, we'll limit also the potential and the result. We have an interesting project in France, the Stream building. It's an HQE project, but actually it has a total circular and flexibility approach, where the aim is to allow for multiple types of use. There's hotel, retail, office, co-working, restaurants, but actually it was thought since the beginning with a modular structure that integrates also the installations, the networks, so that actually you can change the use in time, optimize also the use of lifts and access to different spaces if the uses evolve, but without having to change the installations, the systems that are in there whenever this use happens. So you need to consider this in the program of the building very early, otherwise you don't have that margin of flexibility to do it later, and you'll end up, even if you change the use, you'll end up having to change installation systems. And as Simon showed, it's not neglectable, the impact of all these systems and networks when we're talking about the renovation. So it's a programmatic approach that also needs to be rethought and seen differently in terms of change or evolution of uses in a building, be it to intensify it or to change that use, and how we can minimize that.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you. So I have a question for maybe we can start with Guido, but potentially others will have a view on this as well. One of the concerns that we sometimes hear when we talk about applying a whole life approach to renovation, because this is something that, as Audrey said, we have worked on this topic for a number of years now as a whole network. It's something that we've been really pushing at the European level. One of the concerns we often hear is, will this not make renovation more difficult, more challenging? We don't want to put barriers in the way. So I wonder if Guido, if you have any perspectives on that. Do you see there's a risk of applying whole life thinking or a life cycle approach? Or do you see there's any ways that we mitigate that risk or opportunities?
Well, there's always a risk to doing something differently to what you actually have been doing in the past. So yes, there's definitely a risk, but I think it's something that we must do. I don't think there's a really a reason not to do it. And I think yeah, you start looking at how you do things differently, and you have to take your partners with you on that journey. And yeah, how to mitigate that is it's a difficult question. I think if you're looking at whole life carbon, and I think one of the things with whole life carbon is there's lots of elements that come with it. You really want to understand what is in your building, what you're going to put in your building. So material passports become more important. But then a material passports could actually also be a benefit, because if you know what's in your building, you actually know how you could reuse that or use that in other redevelopments or in similar redevelopments that you do. So I think that's really important. I think carbon pricing is also something that we forget about right now, but will become more important. And that eventually will drip through to material selection as well. So not looking at embodied carbon or whole life carbon will actually be detrimental at a certain stage, because it's going to be more expensive, because you're going to pay for it through the materials that you procure or that you use in a renovation or a building. So definitely there are challenges, but I think we have to face them head on right now, because there's no escaping that we are in a stage that we just need to do things rather than wait and see.
Thanks, Guido. And maybe Anna or Simon, you'd like to come in on that point?
I think that we have a climate urgency in front of us, and we need to make this carbon transformation. If we don't have a whole life cycle approach, we risk actually to be optimized on improving some things and just shifting part of the impact to another part that it's not in our part, but globally the impact will be there. So we need to bring this consideration. It brings challenges indeed, because also the building process is fraction. There are fractions. We transfer elements from one stakeholder to another, but we really need to design with a global performance in mind, and that carbon and energy performance and the impact in people health and well-being needs to be considered. Of course, it's not easy. There's always challenge. Everybody likes to innovate, but not to be the first one. So the risk parameter also is there. But I would say we have no choice than go in that direction. And honestly, we see the market changing. The number of net zero, nearly zero energy projects being demanded is there. The number of clients making requesting portfolio size assessments in terms of energy and carbon to be able to plan the upgrade in the coming years. I see an increasing demand on that. And I cannot mention the project, it's confidential, but we even received a demand for a project that wants to be net whole life carbon zero. What does this mean? That it needs to operate at zero energy, net zero energy, but actually all the systems that will be put in the building need to come already from the platforms that provide reused material, which is a huge challenge in terms of availability, in terms of insurance and all that. But we need people to push us, the engineering and architecture in this sense, that are willing to test and show that it's feasible, that it's possible.
Thanks, Anna. And Simon, any final thoughts from you on that?
Yes, I agree with everything that has been said, of course, but I think I might be a bit reassuring, because I think it's not necessarily doing more studies, but doing it differently, and having another approach, a wider vision, while programming, while designing. So I don't think it's really a lot of constraint. It's just embracing subjects in a global way. And of course, there is something that I didn't say, but the 7 business cases, they revealed that the issue were not exactly the same from one scenario to another, and that we think that the tools has to be adapted to each context and to each budget, of course, of the clients. and maybe sometime a detailed life cycle analysis calculation might be the hammer to to eat the flea, something like that. That is maybe oversized for some small budget, in particular housing, small housing, and so we have to adapt design tools to this kind of context too. So this is some work. And I would say that we also, there is another point about the economy of the project, of course, the cost of those measures. And what is really interesting with the 5 levers is that they can balance each other to do a project almost at the same price, maybe a bit higher. But it's interesting to see that, for instance, tacticity and externality might be maybe cheaper. So that's a really good, interesting point to see it as a whole, and maybe you can balance your budget by those different levers.
Thanks, Simon.
That's probably where it's interesting to have all these levers, all these topics, because buildings are different, contexts are different, budgets are different. And actually, just by providing this panel of considerations to introduce in your thinking around the project, I think that is useful for the market. And indeed, some projects have a budget to go for very detailed studies, others less. What counts is not the number of studies you do or not, or if you have a life cycle assessment or not. I think it's the life cycle mindset, the whole life carbon mindset that you need to bring to the design, whether you do this or that study, but at least that the purpose of reducing carbon, the total impact, that it remains in the project, whatever is the size or the type of project.
Great, thank you, Anna. So we've already reached the end of our allocated time. I'm sure people have other things to go to, or need to go and get a coffee. So I have one final comment here rather than a question. So we have somebody, we have Josefina from the Commission on the call, and she's made a comment just to clarify a point from earlier, that the EU roadmap that the Commission is working on is going to provide or set milestones for that coming policy initiatives will relate to in terms of benchmarks. So the roadmap is not going to set minimum values for whole life carbon specifically. So it will set milestones rather than defining minimum values. So a clarification point there from colleagues from the Commission. And then it just remains for me to thank again our speakers for a really insightful set of presentations. I think there's a lot of anticipation about the forthcoming reports, Simon, so do keep us posted when they're available in English so we can share them as widely as possible. And thank you to our audience for the great questions. I apologize for those whose questions we've not managed to answer. If you feel hard done by that we've not answered your question, then you can follow up with the colleagues who've been presenting. You can get in touch with us. We can try and help you find the information that you're looking for. So thank you for joining us. Thank you again to our speakers, and I wish you all a great rest of your day. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.